afternoon, everybody. Very happy to be here. And for those of you listening in at a later date and time, you'll be listening to this lovely Buffalo accent talk about empowering every learner, UDL, and accessibility with Anthology Ally. My name is Dr. Katie Grinnell. This is the first session in this webinar series, so very happy to be here. Before we continue on, I do want to introduce one of my lovely colleagues who is also here with me, and I'll come back to the agenda. But I've already, given you my name. Essentially, I'm an accessibility strategist here at Anthology, and I work primarily with Ally. So I deliver a lot of different types of trainings and services for organizations and institutions across the globe that have Ally, and it's a very near and dear to my heart type of work. So very excited to be here, and I'm going to turn it over to my wonderful colleague, Dr. Amy Lamolini.
Hey everybody, I am Dr. Amy Lomolini and I'm Anthology's Director of Accessibility. So that means I work across our entire product portfolio as well as all of the inner workings of our organization as a whole. And I help everybody think about accessibility and take action in terms of just improving everything that we do to constantly keep accessibility in mind. I have a background as an instructional designer and I'm currently a faculty member as well. So we get where you're coming from and we are excited to be here with you today.
Thank you, Amy. All right, I am actually going to turn my camera off so that it does not interfere with the bandwidth as I present. So there we go. Okay, so bear with me. We're going to go back to the previous slide just to give a bit of an agenda so you have an idea of what to look forward to. And so we're in the introductions stage of this, if you will. And then we'll move on to some learning objectives. So really, what's the purpose of this? And then we'll get into kind of the gist of the entire session is really to be able to contextualize accessibility and also then bring that into the conversation of universal design for learning and where and how Ally supports that. And then we'll talk a little bit about, some next steps and really kind of look forward to some additional resources and things like that we have available. All right. I did want to just briefly point out that this is a three-part webinar. And I'm sorry, I'm not sure what the slide looks like this. But anyways, this is a three-part webinar series that we have partnered with UDC on. And so this is our first session, but really the whole intention of the series is to really explore how Ally, so Anthology Ally, the digital accessibility tool, supports accessibility and also universal design for learning to really create and sustain inclusive and equitable learning environments. And so each session has its own kind of focal area, and we'll provide practical strategies and guidance for how to improve course content in terms of its accessibility, how to empower all learners, and then also where do we bring in Ally? So how do we leverage Ally's tools to then, of course, help continue emphasizing accessibility and supporting instructors? And so I thought it would be helpful just to go through just a brief kind of schedule, if you will, of all of the different sessions that are part of the series. So today is the first. Session 1 is, of course, Foundations of Accessibility and UDL. The next one, session 2, it's called Enhancing Course Accessibility in Blackboard. That will be held on Tuesday, May 6th from 3 to 4 p.m. EDT. And then the third and final session is the Instructor's Guide to Accessibility. So essentially, we'll explore the different features that Ally provides for our instructors and faculty and how they can use that to, again, create and sustain that inclusive learning environment. And that third and final session will be held on Tuesday, May 13th from 3 to 4 p.m. So our learning objectives for this particular session will be for our learners at the end of this session to be able to define accessibility, digital accessibility specifically, and then also universal design for learning. The second objective is to be able to explain the importance of accessibility and UDL within that larger space of, what is the role, what is the impact that they create, that they have in creating and sustaining inclusive learning environments. And then lastly, how to connect UDL to Anthology Ally. So this is what we hope everybody will be able to do by the end of this session. So it's important that we begin by kind of laying the fundamentals, if you will. So one of the things I failed to mention in my introduction is that I am a history instructor. So I have a PhD in American Studies, and that was primarily in disability history and disability studies. But I teach a lot of general history courses, and I always start with the basics. And a lot of that is because some of these terms and meanings are just so grandiose and so comprehensive. It's just really important to be as specific as possible, right? And then that helps with creating that larger dialogue around its contextualization. So that's typically where I always like to begin. So I always like to start with some slides that essentially provide a little bit of I would say, a statistically oriented view into this window of disability, which will bring us into that larger conversation around accessibility. So again, for those of us that are a little more on the statistically oriented side of things, this slide is really providing important statistics that are coming from the World Health Organization, and I think also the CDC. So what we're looking at here are about 26% and more adults in the United States alone are disabled. 1 in 6 people worldwide are disabled. Between 60 and 80% of disabled students do not disclose their disability. So really what that means is they're not telling folks, they're not sharing that with either an academic advisor, disability services, an instructor, etc. And all of these statistics have their own individual, meanings, but taken together, it's really to think about the fact that when it comes to this identity of disability, disability is the only minority group that everyone can and probably will join at some point in their lives. So it's important that we see its prevalence and that we also are able to kind of make that larger connection into how this really is a part of our larger world, not just in terms of those who are essentially disabled, right? We need to think of all of these additional tangential relations and kind of additional impacts this has. So then when it comes to defining accessibility, and that slide before was very short, again, kind of snippets of statistics that are speaking to specifically our disability statistics. But if we think of then what we saw in that slide and those numbers, and now how that relates to accessibility, where do we go from there? What's the connection? So I think it's helpful to really provide specific definitions, again, of what exactly we're talking about. So when talking about accessibility and how we define it, accessibility refers to the ability for all people to equitably engage with spaces, technologies, services, devices, or environments, regardless of race, class, disability, gender, or sexuality. So it's really, again, equitable access, that barriers are being taken away and that all folks, regardless of their identification, regardless as how they are identifying themselves in terms of their disability, they will have access. Now that access might look a little different, right? And this is really where we think about reducing all of those accessibility barriers, providing different types of accommodations, building with accessibility and universal design in mind from the beginning, right? So that's one definition, and there are lots of different definitions of accessibility. This is one that's a little more general. The second one is a little bit, I think, more specific, especially when we think of it in the context of education. So accessible means that individuals with disabilities are able to independently acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, and also enjoy the same services within the same time frame as individuals without disabilities, with substantially equivalent ease of use. So again, I think this helps to kind of specify a little more about what we mean when we're talking about accessibility. So these are two more general definitions. Obviously, the second one is a little more on the specific side, I think, which is a great segue into our next slide, which is about digital accessibility, because that's really where ALLI comes in. Now, yes, ALLI promotes a lot of different accessibility best practices, but it's intended to help make digital learning environments more accessible. So with that, to define digital accessibility, and this definition is coming from, I believe it's Georgetown Law School. Their technology site has some really great resources, and I liked the coherence of this particular definition. And it states that digital accessibility refers to the inclusive practice of removing barriers that prevent interaction with or access to websites, digital tools, and technologies by people with disabilities. So in this case, this is where we can think of and we can frame and we should frame Ally as a digital accessibility tool because it is intended to be able to remove these barriers, to allow interaction with digital learning content, not just by people with disabilities, but all people, all students, right? All instructors. And I think, the first several slides really focused on the what. I think it's really important to focus on the why, and later on we'll focus on the who. So why does accessibility matter? We always start by talking about accessibility is always the right thing to do, from a moral and ethical space, but ultimately creating more accessible learning content and making your courses more accessible, it widens the scope. It expands the scope for all students to be able to interact, engage, participate with the learning material, to really have a strong learning, experience from that class. And it affords learners more autonomy in their learning engagement. I myself have multiple disabilities, both invisible or non-apparent, and then visible. And I say this quite a bit, so I'm happy to say it again here. But autonomy and the lived experiences of being disabled do not always go hand in hand. So the more that we can carve out spaces for autonomy, the better. That really helps to truly make things more accessible. It makes it, again, so that we really see that you're focusing on the who, and giving them that equitable access. It also removes barriers or obstacles that prevent disabled or not disabled learners from engaging with learning content. And so in this instance, right, if there are specific types of technical barriers to engaging with content, if that student is disabled, that means they don't have any access to the material, right? So they are blocked. There is no equitable access for them. Perhaps you have a student that doesn't have an official diagnosis, or perhaps they haven't disclosed. And it's more so a preference in terms of how they engage with their material. Having different ways that they can do that is absolutely empowering them. And again, that's an example of how it's just widening that scope. And lastly, inclusive design and accessibility absolutely improve the experience for all learners, right? So it's not just our learners that have disabilities. It's in general, it's making a better experience, a better end product. It's more user friendly. It's the usability is stronger, etc. So I think we did a decent job kind of laying the foundations of what is accessibility, what is digital accessibility, and why does accessibility matter? And of course, this slide and what I have on here is absolutely not finite, but it's a good starting point for consideration. So now we'll move into universal design. I made up a word there. Universal design for learning. And really, again, kind of thinking about how to explain this in a way that is, jargon free and is accessible, and then talk about it by seeing how Ally has, these specific ties to UDL for short. So I will typically refer to universal design for learning as UDL, just as an abbreviation. So I think in this case, it's probably even more important to start with the who. So who are we doing this for? And this slide is something that I use quite a bit in my trainings when presenting Ally to faculty and administrators. But we're really thinking about this really diverse body of 21st century learners. And I have some icons up here and different types of learners that we're trying to keep in mind when thinking of how can we support them in these, very diverse, varied learning environments. And again, just like some of these other slides, this is not a finite list. This is just some of those examples. And we want to provide use cases where we know a tool like Ally can provide that support. So for our students, for our learners that have a visible disability, perhaps they wear an AFO, right, for a leg brace on their leg. That's what I have. Maybe they're a wheelchair user. Perhaps they have cochlear implants. This is typically referring to, you're able to see that they're using some type of assistive technology, or that there is a disability that you can see. On the complete opposite end, if we scoot all the way over here to the bottom right-hand corner, we have our invisible disability. Some folks call this a non-apparent disability. And that's really by looking at somebody, you can't tell that they suffer from chronic migraines. And I'm saying that in particular because I do have that. But another example would be you can't look at somebody and tell that they have ADHD, right? There's all different types of impairments and disabilities that are not visible, just by a quick glance. So we want to make sure that we're also providing different types of formats and ways that our learners can engage with content that is accommodating and is supportive. I won't go through all of these different types of learners, but we do have, our first generation students. And perhaps for them, there's a lot of hidden curriculum, I would say, anxiety there, meaning that they show up to school and there are specific expectations that instructors and faculty have of them, but they're not aware of this. This is their first experience. They're the first person in their family to go to college, and they don't necessarily have anybody to ask about as far as expectations go. So are there ways that we can create our learning materials to be a little clearer, very specific and explicit in terms of what we expect, and really, again, have everything kind of ordered in a way that makes a lot of sense. For our students that are what used to be considered more non-traditional students, which is why I put this in quotation marks, the students that are, and again, I teach right now. I think all of my students are working. So this is kind of that antiquated view of, students, I would say in the 80s and 90s and maybe even early 2000s that were non-traditional, but again, are beautiful. Thank you. Our non-traditional students juggling multiple things at the same time. School is not their only responsibility, right? Our international students that are potentially facing language barriers, but also cultural barriers. So for them, having the course laid out in a way that is accessible, that does follow, design best practices, that is going to be beneficial for them as well. So we're trying to think of, all of the different ways and mannerisms that we can really connect to our students to make sure that they feel supported and included. And so that brings us to universal design for learning. So we just looked at the whom, right? So whom are we doing this for? It's always going to be, thinking of the students, right? We're trying to create a strong learning experience for them. And one of the ways we can do this is by applying something like universal design for learning. UDL is a learning framework that is designed to improve and optimize teaching and learning for all people based on scientific insights into how humans learn. So it's something that is typically applied. You're using this as you are beginning to design and kind of flesh out your course materials, and you're planning your syllabus, and you're starting to build what your curriculum is going to look like. And its intention is really is that it's designed to enhance access to learning by reducing any of those physical or cognitive, intellectual, or organizational barriers or other obstacles to learning from the very beginning. So this is really that kind of proactive framework that an instructor, that a faculty member would be using as they are, again, building out a course for a new semester, and really thinking of how they're doing that, the construction of their learning materials, using Ally to ensure that they are accessible, providing multiple ways that students can demonstrate their learning, right? So a little more specifically, you have these three core principles of universal design for learning. And this is a little brain here in the middle of each of these individual circles. So we have multiple means of engagement, and this is speaking more to like the why of learning. We have multiple means of representation, the what of learning, and then multiple means of action and expression, the how of learning. And so what I think I have on this next slide, I'm going to come back to this, is just in case you've never seen what the actual guidelines themselves look like. This is just a screenshot. If you go to the CAST website, it's kind of like an interactive worksheet, if you will, where you can, look into more of these specific areas: access, support, executive function. And again, those 3 core guidelines are broken up in this way. And then built into this are more individual guidelines and suggestions on how to actually implement this. So a little more on UDL. And again, you have all of the information. You are more than welcome to go in and take a little look at the guidelines themselves. But just in a more general perspective, universal design for learning supports the needs and the learning preferences of all students. It's not just a specific demographic. And so this is really where we see, the intention is to build something as accessible and inclusive as possible from the very beginning, and to help support all students, right? And doing that brings us to this second bullet point. In that application of this framework, it helps to avoid retrofitting your pedagogy or your activities later on. That could also mean, more specifically, it could help you to avoid having to remediate content later on to address all of the accessibility issues. So if you're kind of working on everything from the beginning and you're working to make things as accessible as possible, again, it's a better experience for students and ultimately less work for the instructor throughout the course itself. And also, diverse pedagogy really does allow students to have more autonomy, right? To help them remove those barriers to learning, to feel empowered to engage with the material. And that, again, is really what we're trying to do. We don't want to lose student interest because they can't access the material. So we've looked at that. And now we'll talk about universal design, which is very similar to universal design for learning. So universal design is really the intersection, I would say, of accessibility and usability. The more, I would say, crafted definition is that it is the design and composition of an environment so that it can be accessed, understood, and used to the greatest extent possible by all people, regardless of their age, size, ability, or disability. And universal design itself is based on these 7 key principles: equitable use, flexibility in use, simple and intuitive use, perceptible information, tolerance for error, low physical effort, and size and space for approach and use. And you don't need to necessarily to remember all of these. It's more to help kind of frame this a little more specifically of what universal design is. But I think it's helpful to really kind of look at it from an example standpoint, okay? So we have an image here of what's called the curb cut effect. So in this image, a little bit of an image description, we have kind of an illustrated scene that is demonstrating this curb cut effect, right? So you have a simple street setting, there's a sidewalk and the curb. In the foreground, the focus is on a ramp cut into the actual curb. You've got a diverse set of characters that are shown around the ramp. You have, a person in a wheelchair, someone pushing a stroller, somebody pushing like a shopping cart, people on bicycles. 2 folks are sitting on a bench. One person looks to have a cane, and another person has a suitcase right by them. And essentially, the whole point here is really to talk about how this was designed to help our wheelchair users, particularly our disabled World War II vets that returned back to the States in 1945. So that's kind of like the history of this. But what we see here is the language here says that when we design for disabilities, we make things better for everyone. So again, this is the quintessential universal design example, designed again specifically with helping our wheelchair users in mind, but becomes beneficial for all of these other types of folks and these different kind of use cases. So the curb cut itself was actually first implemented in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and this was in 1945. And a couple years leading up to that, you had a lot of different protests, and you had a lot of activism for more support for returning World War II vets when they came back to the United States. And this was specifically for that in Kalamazoo, Michigan. What happened is that this becomes kind of one of the hallmarks, if you will, of the disability rights movement later on in the 60s and 70s. And that really was kind of centralized in Berkeley, at UC Berkeley, and San Francisco in California. And so this then becomes kind of a big thing where you have one of the biggest disability rights advocates, Ed Roberts, pushed for this to have something like this also at Berkeley, where you did have a significant population of disabled folks. And again, that's really where you have it kind of starting as this core central movement. And that led later to Congress passing the Architectural Barriers Act, which was in some ways kind of a predecessor to the Americans with Disabilities Act. So there's my history lesson for the day. But I hope that helps to kind of put this in a better frame of reference. And then I had a little list of some other examples of universal design. So closed captions, right? So again, designed to help those that have hearing impairments or are deaf. What we see here is that this is helpful for parents that are trying to get their kiddos to sleep, and perhaps they're trying to, occupy themselves at the same time, but they do not want to rock the boat as they're trying to get their child to sleep. Perhaps you are in a doctor's office and it's really not appropriate to be blasting a video while you're in the middle of a busy waiting room. So you use the closed captions, right? And these are more just because they're there and they're accessible and they're convenient, right? Not because of any specific disability. Automatic doors are also extremely helpful. Lever handles, so it's a little easier to actually open doors. Voice control, I'm like terrified of saying Alexa too loud, because if my Alexa hears me, then she'll probably do something or order something for me that I don't want. But again, these are just examples of universal design. And then of course our ebooks and our audiobooks. Again, widening the scope and widening the capabilities for people to interact with different types of materials. So now we'll look a little bit at how exactly does all of this kind of fit into ALLI? What exactly does universal design for learning have to do with ALLI? Where is that connection? How might this be helpful to all of you? So similar to my approach from some of the earlier sections of this webinar, what I wanted to do is kind of start with the fundamentals. So at its core, what is ALLI? How do we define it? The definition I use the most is, well, not the most, this is what I always use, is that it is a digital accessibility tool. It's embedded in Blackboard. It's technically LMS agnostic, but this is the LMS that UDC uses. And it is designed to help make digital course content more accessible and inclusive. And that is intentionally a little on the vague side. And that's only because we are providing a lot of different features for different types of users. So this next section is really, who is it for? Okay. So think of this as an expansion of what it is. So for students, ALLI provides alternative formats of contents. So let's say they have a Word document syllabus, and perhaps they would like that as, or need that as an audio version. They can do that. They can access that as a Braille ready file format. They can use the Beeline reader, right? All of these different alternative formats are available to all students. And for instructors, ALLI will provide feedback and guidance on how to make their content and their courses more accessible. And instructors also have access to the alternative formats, which is important for multiple reasons. And then lastly, administrators who really have more detailed data and insights to help really think of how to approach improving accessibility as a whole at that institution. So that's really what ALLI is and who is it for. So as we move into the next slides that really kind of explain how ALLI supports UDL, just keep these kind of different user groups in mind. So for our instructors, there are 3 key features, and I'm bringing them up because then I will speak of them in specific relation to UDL in the next couple slides. So these 3 key features, we're going to start with the alternative formats, which I just briefly explained. Essentially, what happens here is when an instructor goes and either uploads or creates digital content in their course in Blackboard, ALLI will automatically generate alternative formats of that content, right? So again, you as an instructor, you upload your syllabus, and then a student could access that as an HTML version, EPUB, electronic Braille, audio, translated version, etc. In the middle, we have that instructor feedback feature. And this is essentially feedback on an individual content item. So that syllabus will continue with that example. The instructor wants to get a sense of how accessible it is and what they might need to do to address any accessibility issues. That's what this will do. It's going to provide the guidance on how to address the issues. It lists any and all issues that have been found, and then that how to and the context. And that specific feature feeds into our final feature, which is the course accessibility report. So this is faculty facing. It's essentially an amalgamation of all of the digital learning content in your course, and what its accessibility score is, what are the different types of issues that have been found, and it includes different ways, different kind of targeted remediation approaches that instructors can use to essentially determine how do they want to begin and how should they approach their content remediation plan, if you will. So alternative formats, instructor feedback, and the course accessibility report. These are the three key features that Ally provides for our instructors. And there's nuances to each of these essentially, but at the core, this is really what we're talking about. So then if we think of how specifically those features, like where are we drawing this connection between Ally and universal design for learning? The biggest way that we do that, and the feature that really primarily showcases and aligns with universal design for learning, are the alternative formats. And what I have up here on the screen is an example of a menu that would essentially pop up if an instructor went in, or a student, again, they're available to both, and they selected the alternative format icon, they selected it and they opened it up. This is essentially an example, just an example of what they would potentially see. All of the different alternative formats available: tagged PDF, HTML, I think I've mentioned all of these so far: electronic braille, audio, Beeline Reader, immersive reader, and the translated version. And the significance of these is that, they're providing students with options, all of these options. They can download these as many times as they want. There is, of course, autonomy in this. There is no way an instructor is ever going to know which student goes in and downloads which alternative format. That anonymity is protected, that autonomy is is being emphasized by this action. Students don't have to disclose, and they don't have to be officially diagnosed with any type of disability in order to access the alternative formats. They're available for everybody. And really, again, we're thinking of the different ways that the alternative formats support such a wide, diverse group of learners, right? Different learner needs and preferences, abilities, but also devices. I think that's an important component in thinking of our diverse 21st century learners and what are they using to actually access their course content. So in that case, are there specific types of formats more conducive to a mobile device? Yes, that would be like an HTML file for sure, or even a PDF. And as I mentioned, the alternative formats are also available to instructors. So I'm going to come back to this slide, but I wanted to have it in here twice because I want to be able to kind of make a larger connection. So what I've done here is I've essentially gone into the guidelines and found within each of these three core guidelines, or principles, I should say, I wanted to be able to connect to the specific areas that Ally is supporting universal design for learning by way of these alternative formats. And so here I have it organized by those core principles, right? So multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, and then multiple means of action and expression. And so essentially what I've done is I've gone into the actual guidelines themselves, and I've been able to kind of tease out these specific areas where we do see Ally really being, or I should say the alternative formats essentially aligning with universal design for learning. So you can have this to go back to at any point in time. But really where we see this being, brought out is within the multiple means of engagement. So it's this optimizing choice and autonomy, and students, the learners, having the ability to choose what type of format they're using to engage in their course content. And then it's our multiple means of representation. So supporting opportunities to customize the display of information and supporting multiple ways to perceive that information. And again, this is by means of the different formats, different alternative formats that are offered. And lastly, are multiple means of action and expression. So optimizing access to accessible materials and assistive and accessible technologies and tools, and then using multiple media for communication. So this is more specific to kind of like actual pedagogy, but for sure what we do see is that Ally, by way of the alternative formats, is providing accessible materials, right? Providing a variety of multiple, forms of media for communicating the course content. Now, this is the, I would say, primary way where we see the universal design for learning kind of come to fruition and being manifested when it comes to Ally. But that doesn't mean there's not other areas of impact that I think are really important and worth noting. So the instructor feedback feature, and also this feeds largely, or again, into the course accessibility report. The purpose of this tool, again, is to help instructors because it's going to identify accessibility issues that were found and then provide the what, the why, and the how. And so what we're looking at right here is kind of a legend, like a map legend, if you will, that breaks down the instructor feedback feature. We have an in-browser preview over here on the left side, which is really fantastic, and it will highlight the specific issue that you as the instructor are exploring to see what you need to do to address it. But the panel of the instructor feedback feature is really what we're looking at and kind of what I'm speaking to when it comes to the what, the why, and the how. So over here on the right side, you essentially will have the same format regardless of the type of file that you have, that you've opened up the instructor feedback panel for. So you'll have the name of the item. You will have the score. So from 0 to 100, how accessible according to Ally is this specific file. If there's more than one issue that was detected, you'll have the ability to select that if we were in the live site. But what I really wanted to focus on is these two tabs down here. So what Ally is going to do is it's going to highlight one issue at a time. And that is to help instructors take this in bite-sized chunks, not try to address everything all at once, because that can really make for a frustrating experience, but to take it one thing at a time. And so what we see here is the specific name of this issue that's being highlighted, and that is that this document contains images that are missing a description. These two tabs down here are really where we can also see these larger connections to universal design for learning. So it's in pretty small print, but there is a pretty large turquoise arrow pointing to this text box, and this tab says what this means. This is what I refer to as the what and the why. If we were in the live site and I selected that, it would bring me to a small little pop-up that describes what the issue is. So it gives me the what. And I think that's really important because it is providing an equitable experience for all instructors. We can't expect everybody to know what it means when a document contains images that are missing a description. So Ally provides it in really accessible and clear language. And then it also includes the why. And this is usually the context, right? Why do we need to do this? Whom will it impact if we don't? Those are that, that critical context that, for me, I find that that's such a big component that pushes me, that would propel me to keep going and making sure I'm addressing the issues, because I wouldn't want this, to be a barrier for any of my students. And then lastly, the how to, right? So the what and the why, and then the how. So I bring this up because it has these kind of connotations in a positive way of UDL that we see with living within this particular feature. And because what we're doing, what the Ally team is really trying to do, is provide this UDL mindset, if you will, for faculty and instructors by really providing the what, the why, and the how, and coming at it from an accessibility perspective that encourages the importance of humans being, and subject matter experts, right, our faculty and instructors being involved in addressing the issues, learning about what they mean, who they impact if they're not addressed, why they're important, etc. And a lot of this too is meant to help, hopefully alter future course design, practices where instructors have learned from this, that now they understand, they need to make sure their images have an image description, right? Or that they have sufficient color contrast. So perhaps that's something they take with them the next time they're going to build out course materials for a different semester. That would really be kind of our ultimate goal. So to wrap things up, I think it's important to end with some considerations, and then I have some additional resources that are available for everybody if you're interested. So I think in terms of accessibility, I think it's always important to follow the baby steps approach. And the image I'm using here is taken from one of my favorite movies, What About Bob? I'm sure Amy is shaking her head, teasing me, because I always try to include this in my presentations. First of all, it's pop culture, but the movie What About Bob, is an 80s movie. But what we're looking at here is an image of the actor Richard Dreyfuss. He plays Dr. Leo Marvin. He is a psychologist in the movie. He's holding up his book called Baby Steps. So he wrote this book. This is kind of his approach to helping his patients that have really severe anxiety and OCD, which is exactly what Bob, so we only see the back of Bob's head, played by Bill Murray, that is what he has. So that's why he sees Dr. Marvin, to be able to get some help in how to address his severe anxiety and OCD. And it's all about baby steps. And there's a lot of, ironic moments in the movie, but I just think it's a generally universal approach to most things, right? And taking it step by step. And that really kind of follows in line with what we hear at Anthology, particularly when it comes to accessibility, this mindset of progress over perfection, that we want to encourage instructors to celebrate, any kind of win. You don't have to make everything perfect, right? This is an ongoing commitment. It's a journey. It's not a destination. I know these sound, a lot like different, country songs, but this really does, ring true when it comes to accessibility, and practicing that patience. It's a learning process. And so with that, it's also important to note that you are not alone in doing this. And that is, one of the reasons, why we're here today, to be able to provide that support. But I also want to point out some additional support and resources that are available for everybody at any point in time. So first and foremost, our ally user group. So this is a community of global ally users. There is both a discussion forum, and that's the image that we see right here, where anybody can essentially ask questions. You can see what conversations and trends and topics are when it comes to not just ally, but accessibility as well. So this is a really, really passionate group of folks. Anybody can join, so we'd love to have you. There are also monthly meetings, and actually they're, I think, every 2 months. I think we've altered that a little bit. And the two user group leaders are from two different partner institutions that have Ally that we work with. So we do support this, but this isn't run by anthologists. Next, we have our help site. So help.blackboard.com/anthology, or nope, that doesn't make sense. Sorry. help.blackboard.com/ally. There we go. So this is where you get, any of your kind of, quick go-to information, but also a lot of other wonderful in-depth resources, tutorials and guidance and instructional based content on accessing Ally for students, instructors, and administrators. You can also sign up to follow release notes. And we also have something called the Communication and Adoption Toolkit. This has all sorts of goodies and resources in there for instructors and administrators to kind of continue pushing the adoption of Ally for their institutions. We have Ally office hours. We've also updated the cadence of this, so I apologize for the typo here. These are held every other month. This is led by the Ally product managers and others from the Ally team. We do demonstrations of, latest releases and Ally developments, but primarily it is a Q&A session with the team. So you can submit questions ahead of time, and our director of product for Ally will answer them. And it's really, again, a very lively group. So we'd love to have you there as well. Anybody can join. Next, we have the Anthology community. So this is really kind of a collaborative platform, if you will, of global Anthology users. And then within it, it has different, more specific areas of focus. So there's a discussion forum, and there's one for accessibility, information on the various user groups. There's a blog We don't typically post, well, we do have some ally specific content, but we try to keep a lot of it also just more in general when it comes to accessibility, with just a smattering of ally talk in there. And then we have, lastly, what's called the member idea exchange. And I'll go to the next slide that focuses on that. So this is essentially like a virtual suggestion box where you can provide feedback, feature requests on any anthology tool that you have. Of course, allies included in there. And our team regularly checks this, and we use this to help, into consideration for our roadmaps and things like that. So that is the end of my talking for today. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then we have time for questions and comments, anything like that. Want to make sure everybody feels comfortable knowing that they can ask questions, and we're really happy to be able to answer them. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen in just a moment as soon as I can figure this out. I realize the irony of that because I work for a technology company. So there's that. Okay, I'm going to turn my camera back on. Hopefully. There we go. Are there any questions or anything that I can help with, either myself or my lovely colleague, Dr. Amy Lamolini? Just going to keep an eye on the chat here.
I have a question. Oh, go ahead. Yep. Go ahead, Julian.
Thank you. I just, as somebody who used to use Ally or uses Ally in Blackboard, and kind of think about its earlier functions, I think it did used to have functions where it could help, where you could directly correct a document within Ally. Is that something that you are looking to bring back? I know it can do that for certain images. But more along the lines of PDFs and tagging PDFs and things of that nature. Are you looking to add those accessibility features so that faculty won't have to leave Ally to go fix it? They can just fix it within Ally, and it can be a bit more seamless?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. So yes and yes. That functionality, so right now how it is, there's kind of two, I would say, categories of content. So you have your files that you're uploading, and I think that's kind of like what you're referring to, like a PDF. But then you also have that WYSIWYG content. So that's what you're building directly into your course in Blackboard. So if you need to make an announcement or, a module description or something like that, if you want to use the instructor feedback for that, you are addressing that directly in the course. So it's a different experience, as opposed to the PDFs and things like that, where we historically, that's always been kind of the method for remediating that content, right? You pull up Ally to provide the guidance and things like that, and the instructions, and then you open up whatever tool you created that in. So that's kind of how that has always been approached. What we did just announce, we had our roadmap meeting, our roadmap session. We have it, I think, a few times a year, and our director of product shared, and I can send more details of this, we have a recording of it, that in the next 3 to 6 months, what's being worked on is more what I would call like inline PDF remediation, in particular. So that would mean not having to have access to Adobe Acrobat and doing that in that separate file, but doing that right there. So that's specifically to, I think, adding titles and changing the language, and then also being able to OCR, which is optical character recognition, a PDF. And then more to follow after that. So yes, that's something that we are currently working on, and hopefully later in the year, we'll have more to share on that.
Thank you.
Of course. Are there any other questions or anything else that, either Amy or I can help with?
I was just going to say, if you could leave them with one tip, what would it be? What's one thing that they can do today to be more inclusive in their course design and to learn more about this?
Run your course accessibility report.
There you go.
I think that's a great starting point. And just take it step by step and use the guided remediation approaches to address, your content, and think about what do you know? What is your knowledge level, your skill set when it comes to this? And be honest and realistic and use that in terms of how you approach it. But that's exactly what I do. So the schools that I've worked at for the last almost 20 years, all of them have had ally. So I've been able to actually practice this in my own, teaching, and that's typically where I begin is that course accessibility report, and it's helpful. And I love seeing that overall score go up and just knowing the impact it has on all of the students.
That's a great tip. I'll also add reach out to Kayla and your teams for additional support. So if you're not sure what to do or where to start, reach out to those on campus that are doing this and learn from each other.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
Thank you so much for taking the time to present your insights with us. Again, part 2 of this webinar will be on May 6th at 3. We'll dive deeper into this content, but this was great. Like, I really appreciate both you and Amy.
Thank you for having us. We really appreciate it. It was a great opportunity for us just to keep, widening this conversation. I think it's so important. And Julian's question was perfect and poignant. And I'm happy to share with Kayla, for anybody that's interested, the link to the recording of our roadmap session, because there's lots of wonderful things coming down the pipeline. So happy to share that too.
Yes, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Good luck with the end of the semester.